Okay. Welcome everybody to the meeting. And I'm also going to start the recording in a moment. So everybody be aware that you should mute yourself when you're not speaking so as to cut down on background noise. And let me just make sure that we are now recording in the cloud. So with that, I will turn this over to our chairperson, Audrey Carter. Go ahead, Audrey.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to officially call the September 16th meeting of the ICA for Harrisburg to order. You see familiar faces. You also see one new face. I'll introduce him in a second. First, I want to tell you that Jeff Engel, our general counsel, will not be joining us today. He had emergency oral surgery and sent me a picture of him with gauze and mask, and he didn't know I was a dentaphobe. So right about now, I'm a little queasy just thinking about what he went through. We're also awaiting Neil, and so Jeffrey will let us know when he pops on. The new face is Mark Ryan, and I'd like to welcome him. He is the new appointee from the State's Department of Budget. He serves as a special advisor to the budget secretary. And Mark's uniquely qualified to join us because he serves in the same position for the Philadelphia ICA. And I teased him and said, you'll never see as many zeros when we're looking at the budget here in Harrisburg. He also serves on the Convention Center board in addition to doing all his day job. Doug knows him, and Marita Kelly also worked with Mark in the 90s. So he's among some old friends and making some new friends. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to serve on this board on behalf of the Secretary of the Budget, Jen Swales. Thank you.
Wonderful. Our first order of business today is approving the minutes from the July Zoom meeting. I am assuming you've all had a chance to take a look at them. And are there any suggestions, additions, or questions? And if not, could I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
A second?
A second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Aye. Passes. They're accepted. Jeffrey, would you please give us an update on the finances for the ICA, please?
Okay. The board should have received in your folders a document marked ICA Bills Paid Report as of today's date. And I just wanted to first note that this is actually a 2-month report because we did not meet last month. So this covers everything in the months of August and so far through the month of September. So there are a number of 2-month payments in this folder. You will note also in this document that we did receive, as we had talked about last time, our year 3 partial allocation from the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. And just to note for everybody, that's a partial allocation of $42,000 because of the partial state budget, which was approved by the General Assembly. So we still have hope that the balance, or $58,000 more, will be forthcoming in the second part of the current state fiscal year. But we did receive our first allocation, which is very good. So our starting balance for this 2-month period was $77,707. And our ending operating balance is $108,833.17. So we have a pretty good fund balance at the moment. And we have earned year to date for the calendar year $14.80 in interest from FNB Bank. And we appreciate every penny that we can get. So that is where we are as of today. And I entertain any questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Jeffrey. That's great. It seems impossible to believe that we've been doing this for 6 months. I think we're all ready for some kind of normal, and we find it and treasure it in whatever way and whenever we can find it. We've achieved a lot during those months, but there's still a lot to be done in these final months of the final 4 months, or is it, well, 3.5 months now, I guess. In a few minutes, we'll spend some time talking with the Controller's Office with Charlie and Bill about debt, but we will first turn to talking about the mid-year report. And just a few comments before we start talking about that. We continue to offer our services in whatever way we can to the city. And specifically, I know that there's a lot of assistance that Jeffrey could lend to them, especially in this time where they are searching for a director of finance. I have not heard an update on that, so I am assuming the search is still ongoing. And relative to vacancies, we also, as you know, have 1 vacancy left on our board, and we are awaiting an appointment from Senator Costa's office. Finally, just quickly, we've been in touch with the city to encourage moving forward with the drafting of an agreement. In doing so, we continue to advocate the fact that the city council should be a full-time partner in that agreement. Amazingly, we are fully a year since we submitted the initial draft to the city. And we continue to believe, as we did last November when Neil and Jeff sat down to crank out a final, that it was easy to identify the differences. And I think everyone believes we must and can move forward. And I'm still hopeful that we can try and get a meeting on the calendar here sometime before the end of September so that we can really move ahead. We haven't had a chance to talk about the mid-year report together, but we did together come up with some questions that we sent to the city, and Mark Woolley was nice enough to send a response, which I believe everyone received and hopefully has had a chance to review. So I thought it might be good just to spend a few minutes talking about it because we've not been able to do so. And I'd like to encourage Charlie and Bill, since they're on with us, that if they have any insights, please feel free to chime in, and then afterwards we'll move on to the debt discussion. So here we go. Any comments? I know that one thing that, because Jeffrey's going to keep track of any questions that come up here so we can send a follow-up. I know on the revenue side, Jeffrey just mentioned that we had received our allocation from the state. And I couldn't see that the city has received its appropriate 5/12 share of the 5 million. I believe it was only like a 1.3 million or something like that. So I'd be curious to know whether that has come through or whether it is held up somewhere.
This is the fire subsidy that's
Right. I'm assuming it appears in the public safety line because it has a budget of about 6.8 million. And very little.
You're familiar with the finances, whether or not you're familiar with whether or not the state allocation for the fire subsidy has been received in the current fiscal year by the city?
I don't know sitting here. I'm sure I was told one way or the other with 1,000 other facts. But that's an easy enough answer to get.
Okay.
And I will find out, and Charlie may know.
Do you know, Charlie? No. Can't.
Oh, there it is. I'm still learning this. We don't know. There. A lot of work for nothing. But
Okay, that's
I
good.
think the wire transfer
We're
is
not
in.
sure, but we'll find out.
Any other observations or questions? I mean, maybe what we can do is move from revenue to expenses and to general observations.
May I ask a question regarding the mid-year report? I have a question on the status of two things in the report that weren't clear to me. One of them was that during the whole pandemic shutdown, the city had instituted a hiring freeze, and the second one was the city had instituted a freeze on capital expenditure. And it wasn't clear from the answers what's the current status of those two freezes that were implemented, and what's the outlook for those from now to the end of the year?
So the mayor, and it's either the end of June or early July, the hiring freeze, when we went to, I forget if it's when we went to yellow, was then lifted. And we lifted it when we were able to bring back the people from furlough. So we had furloughed codes officers because they physically could not inspect inside properties. So that is part of both the financial and that reality of not bringing in new people when we have people on furlough. There's a provision in the union contract that has some effect on that. So we did both of those things, and late June, early July is when that was lifted, and then the capital projects then restarted. I know there's a number of road projects they're trying to move forward with. You know, they're a mixed bag of funding. Sometimes it's a mixed bag of who performs them. That is, sometimes we do a little bit of funding and PennDOT does the whole project and puts it in. So I know a number of those are in the pipeline. Obviously, we're running into the reality of asphalt stops being made. And so there's only so far they can go.
Neil, can I drop a recommendation? I'll have your attention on the capital spending item. At my day job, I just had a project that was, restarted. That was paused right when COVID pandemic started in March, and we just restarted it. And the rebid came in 10% higher. It was for building construction items. I wanted to drop a suggestion to you that anything that's under the capital expenditure side, for example, if the city's plan is to proceed with building renovations, for example, to assume that the pre-COVID budgetary estimates are, you should really assume that they're going to come in double-digit percentage higher than what they would have prior to March, and then evaluating them in that light, because I think that would you'd be surprised at the amount of escalation and the volatility right now in construction prices due primarily to a shortage of materials.
I think our folks are painfully aware of that. So, and that's, what happens a lot of times with public bids, because they're limited to literally how many dollars can be in them, is sometimes you have to down the scope of the project with what can be afforded by what the bids come in. That is one of the realities of public construction. We're not building a whole building, so it is always a project. You could probably do a block less, one less set of ramps at an intersection, depending what the project is. But they're very aware of the problem with pricing and bidding.
Do you anticipate there being changes in scope? Because it looks like from the mid-year report, it looks like the plan is still to pursue as much of the capital expenditure as possible. Is that my understanding accurate there? And do you think that?
I think that is the objective. There's nothing from the city's point of view, capital expenditures wise, that's happening that isn't needed to be happening. And it's often tied to other people's projects, not just our own. We just got a notice from PennDOT for the State Street work today. I mean, we rarely are standing by ourselves on these things, and it's a multi-entity effort. I mean, I think you've probably seen, when you've seen the streets being dug up, you'll see CRW there at one point, UGI there at another,
yeah.
us at another. And if you back that up, you don't just back that up, you back up the year after that and the year after that. And the rule of thumb is it's 10% more every year to do the same project automatically, just in cost. So before it gets too far out of hand, the idea is to keep moving as hard as you can on those. No guarantee it'll happen. The bids have to come in a way that are workable. And we have, if a bid is just too high, a project can't go forward, has to be redesigned.
Neil, would it be possible to receive a drill down on the capital expenditure plan? I'd ask to kind of where things stand right now as you know, with the projects that are desired to be completed and the, you know, the initial budget that was made. And I'd really be interested in seeing that and knowing the status of what's going on with the capital expenditure plan, you know, based on the current 2020 budget that's currently being pursued.
I actually have trouble visualizing what you're talking about in terms of a document. That wouldn't be a document. So that would be a series of decisions that are made on what projects are moving forward. That's a series of documents, but there's not a document that says these are the pieces.
I'm visualizing the list of the capital expenditure, the items that were part of the 2020 budget when it was approved.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those items, if they've been put out to bid and the pricing has come in higher or lower, the scope has changed from what was originally budgeted. I think I'd be interested in.
I got you. Some I know some on that weren't going to go forward. There may have been some substitutes in there based on grant money that came in, which is pretty typical year in and year out.
Yeah.
I can get you what is in the pipeline, you know, but I know that, you know, bids are just going out on, I think there's a RCAP grant that went to HRA, for example. We are working with PennDOT on part of that project, and the money is passed through, but they still don't have the final grant agreement, and no one can step a foot into the water until the grant agreement comes and gets executed, because it's a reimbursement grant. So we front the money, but it's reimbursed, you know, from the Commonwealth. But I can get you what's in the pipeline in some sort of form.
Thank you.
Doug? One thing I've learned is that if you have your mic on, all you have to do is move and that little yellow box comes over to you. So don't sneeze, don't do anything, because we'll immediately look at you. So sorry about that. I think some of the news was heartening to me, certainly looking at some of the numbers that have come in. When you look at the EIT and the LST, I would have predicted a much more precipitous drop, but it could also be lagging relative to always 1 month behind. And then I try and mesh it with the reports that we get from Charlie and Bill, you know, to see how much we've caught up in July and August, and very grateful always for the where we should be percentage-wise. Makes it an easy review. Jeffrey, did you have a question?
Just a reminder, I'm sure Neil's got a bunch of things on his desk, but Neil, you were going to get us the budget amendments that have been approved by council so that we could keep up with how things, I'm sure you're going to get those for us still.
The city clerk told me he sent them to you directly. That's why I did not.
Maybe I missed them. I apologize.
So,
I will make sure I have them.
he didn't copy me when he did it, so I can't tell you that happened. But
And I'm sure he was telling the truth, so I will go back through my emails and I will find them. Thank you. I appreciate it.
We got several $20,000 adjustments, but I think it was the larger ones that we were looking for, which I think had to do with the CARES Act monies that were pulled in to the budget, that sort of the thing, how we got from 74 to 76.
So all of those go through a formal same front cover page budget reallocation, and that's what the clerk had told me he had sent. They have a series of schedules behind them, and each schedule represents a whole series of different things depending why the money is moving. So I will double check, but I was told he was sent, so I will double check. So
well, and I think Jeffrey can go back to Kirk, and that's easy enough.
And I will note your question led us to realize there was an error in what was posted after the last meeting in July. We had to go have the clerk's office go fix it. They had the wrong exhibit. It was an old exhibit they attached to, that was not the one voted on by council. So we we fix the public record. I will note they're all visibly available on e-codes, which is where the city keeps its minutes, its agendas, its ordinances. It's all there and searchable right there on the e-code system, and it goes back quite a ways.
Thank you. I'll circle back and make sure I get them either from Kirk or I'll look at E-code. I've done that before. So thank you.
Sure.
Any other comments? I know this is an important document because, as we mentioned, the city is building its FY21 budget, and it's also at the same time, I'm hoping, working on its revised 5-year financial plan, which is coming due at the end of October. So
That is my understanding.
So if there aren't any more comments, I am going to turn the meeting over to Charlie and Bill. Thank you again for joining us today. And this time we gave you the power to share your documents. So, and you were also nice enough to share them, and Jeffrey distributed them to the members of the board. But we're really eager to have you drill down and share your insights on how, when, and how much this debt will save us once it's paid off.
Sure. Thank you guys for inviting us over. We put together a number of things. The first thing we wanted to do was sort of bring you up to speed on where we think the year is going to end based all the way now through August. And then talk a little bit about what our overall fund balance looks like in the general fund. And then some scenarios relative to various options on debt. It's sort of the position of this office that we don't like debt generally, but particularly, that's not really true. We don't like debt that isn't tied to anything. All the payments we're making in the city right now are things that either are gone or just bad decisions that were made in the past. All this debt, the general obligation bonds, if you go through the documents on these GO bonds, are for things that had useful life of 5 years or less, and the bonds are still here. So the things are all gone. And every year we spend $8 million on those GO bonds. And luckily we're coming to the end of them. Like the end, 2022 is the end of the GO bonds. And that is an $8 million plus payment once a year. And it'll be a delightful day when those GO bonds go away. And that was part of the old financing scheme of the prior administrations, primarily Steve Reed. Linda had nothing to do with that. And then coming along behind that was the money that AMBAC loaned us to pay our debt service payments when we didn't have the cash to do it. They stepped in as the insurance company and paid our debt service payments, and then and that is the origin of the AMBAC number. We have been paying 6.75% interest on that number, and we aren't making any payments. So that number has continued to grow, and I guess when we started talking about this, the options about these debt service payments, we owed about what, 20 million? Now we owe 25, and it's just all interest, and it continues to be out there. So we have looked at a number of ways to look at this debt and our fund balances. And so if you look at, we're just looking at the actual numbers we have through the end of August. The fund balance in the general fund right now, close of business August 31st, was $51 million, which in this environment, in this time, in city government, is an astonishing cash position. Keeping in mind that 25 million of that could be characterized as the money we borrowed from AMBAC. That's how I like to look at it. We really only have $16 million in actual our money. The rest of it's money that we borrowed and we apparently didn't really need. So if you look at that first table, that's where we're looking at the column that says budgetary fund balance down at the bottom, and it's 51.3. The next table is the general fund projection on expenses and revenue. And we went, if you look at the August 31st, we're looking at a fund balance projection, revenue being, expenses being 31 million and revenue being 40 million. The fund balance comes out to about $37 million. Now, the one thing that's making that number looks good, but it is good. But when we get to the end of December, it's only 32, and that's because in September we make that $8 million GO bond payment. But still, that's a pretty good place to end up in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic. We're $4 million higher than we were at the beginning of the year. And we can go back and try to figure out why that happened, but expenses are down, revenues are up. You're right, Audrey, that the EIT and LST continue even through the end of August. If you go to the next page, we have revenues, both actuals and projected, and you can see that the 2020 projection versus 2019 actuals for the EIT and LST are about the same, what we expected. So that's amazing too. People are working in this town somehow. The real hits are in priority parking. We're off 3 million there, and we're off $1 million in property tax. So, I mean, that is where we are cash-wise at the end of 2020. And we're going to have about projected fund balance in 2020 will be about $33 million. We do not see anything on the horizon that had any kind of plan for that $32 million. And so we looked at some scenarios about what we could do with some of that cash that might make give the city more options. I'd like to be able to have options, management options, and not get backed up against the wall where we can't do anything. We're forced to do things, and I don't particularly like that feeling. So we put in that very last page, we just sort of looked at the options we have with that cash that we have to see what kind of changes occur when we make different decisions about paying that debt. And so if you look at the very last page, which is called debt analysis, we have the do nothing scenario, which is the path we're on now. Even though we have $5 million in the budget, we haven't seen any movement toward making that payment. So, and I also want to say that for simplicity's sake, we didn't go into the variety of ways we could get more money by paying the debt sooner. The agreement that they have in place, I believe it's in place. Neil, you correct me if I'm wrong, but we have a deal in place with AMBAC if we do certain things, they'll change the terms of the payback favorably.
Right. The term sheet was approved last year. Literally, the agreement, which was provided for the term sheet, which discounts it, I think it's $1.38 credit for every dollar paid under this, but on the back end of the debt, not on the front end of the debt. And that's the first year, and it steps down over 3 years how much credit we get, and it caps at $8 million that can be paid early and get a credit in that period of time. Now, some of those details plainly have to change because of there was timelines in there that COVID just sort of wiped off the face of the earth. So that part would have to go back. We need judicial approval after there's council approval because the agreement with AMBAC that you're referring to that starts the payment is subject, it was approved by a court order as the way to resolve the AMBAC claims back during the receivership, when the receiver entered into a settlement agreement, had it approved by the court. And to undo it, we have to have the judge sign off that we can alter that agreement. So there is a process that comes that now, from my perspective, moves us down the road even further, because the courts, while open, are not really open. Everything we have in court is sort of moving very, very slowly. But that's where it is, as I know.
So for simplicity's sake, we didn't get into the various scenarios that are possible with the agreement that AMBAC has entered into with the city. So the things that we have on the sheet that we have now are more or less the worst case scenarios. If we got no discount at all from AMBAC, where would we be? And what we looked at was what really changes is how long the payments are fixed. Monthly payments or annual payments are fixed. It's the length of the payments that is the variable. And so we showed here the cost of the interest and the payoff date, which was, we're saying that the last day that we owe money to AMBAC under these various scenarios. And so if we don't do anything, the interest is going to cost the city $20 million, and the payoff date will be March in 2029. If we pay $5 million, the interest cost drops to $17 million, and the payoff date is 2 years, or 9/15/27. If we pay 10, it's the payoff date moves up to a full year, and if we pay 15, the payment date moves up to 3/15/25. And then you can see the subsequent reduction in the amount of interest that the city has had to pay. What also looks likely is if we get down to the last year, the balance due is actually manageable, so that we could conceivably get into 2023, 2024, 2023 without any AMBAC payment, depending on what the fund balance continues to look like. So I just thought it would be useful for you to see the various scenarios and options that you have related to this debt. We already have cut the length of time down by, was it 3 or 4 years?
Well, it was 2032 under the original schedule, and since we didn't take any more loans, it's 29.
We had worked with the mayor to encourage him to at least not take any more loans. The terms of the deal we had when we got here in 2013, when I started, we were allowed to borrow a little over $2 million a year to put money toward our debt service payment. It became clear to me that we didn't need to borrow that money. We were able to convince the mayor to stop doing it, and that saved us a couple extra years and several $1 million. It's hard to believe that these little changes can make such a big deal, the big difference in both timeline and total interest, but they do. At any rate, those are the options that are before you. I mean, you obviously can't do anything about this debt, but I thought you should see it, because it seems to me quite compelling, especially since if we have other uses for the money, then I think you should go ahead and do things and make different decisions. But right now, there's nothing competing for it. It makes sense to me to try to pay some of the debt down. That's sitting in the controller's office, which is not running the city. And I wouldn't be presumptuous enough to think that I know how to do that. I'm just saying that given everything else that we can see from the fourth floor, it looks like a useful thing to do to pay down the debt, or at least some of it.
Any questions for Charlie and Bill? Observations? Kathy?
Charlie, this is Kathy Speaker MacNet. I'm curious whether or not this listing of options has been presented to the city and whether or not you've gotten any feedback at this point.
We have, over the years, talked to the mayor about this, and he always seemed pretty receptive to it. So why it is where it is, I don't know. Because we always walk out of his office thinking, yeah, he's probably going to do something like this. So he does have $5 million in the budget this year. So, I mean, that's a start. And I would encourage him to actually do that. And if we get close to the end, I always told him, I said, you can do this once a year. Let's wait till we get close to the end of the year. We're in December, and you have a really good idea what's going to happen then. You have a pretty good idea what's going to happen next year, that maybe you could just pull the plug on it right then. And they'll let us pay that. They'll let us pay down as much as we want once a year, as long as it's over $1 million. So my instinct is that we just kind of wait till the very end of the year and see what kind of cash we have, and then throw some cash out there. I don't know what he's thinking.
Neil, do you have any insight?
Kathy, I have lots of insights, but
That you can share?
I will be frank. I believe we are dealing. I tell Charlie this, and I tell the mayor this. I think we're dealing with the original debate in the United States between the two of them, the Jeffersonian view and the Hamiltonian view of debt. The mayor had negotiated a discount on that money, which was always his objective, and that took 3 years of negotiation with AMBAC. Getting $1.38 for every dollar you pay is a pretty good place to be with tax dollars. It would have been done, but for COVID. The agreement went down to city council, and then everything froze. I don't know collectively where everybody is, because while we see the revenue coming in, everyone knows that the future is a little more hazy. A lot of our revenue comes from state workers on the income tax side. They're coming back in November. We don't know what they're going to do. So we don't know if the revenue is going to take a precipitous hit or not, or that. AMBAC has wanted to have further discussions because of COVID, and that will go on. But we're not going to do a bargaining in a public venue. But I think our impression would be, if there's a further negotiation with AMBAC, it would be further in our favor than it was, because they are also worried about their cash flow position. So I don't know where that will end up. I just know that because it needs judicial approval to do things related to the settlement agreement with AMBAC, it's just an arc that has to happen. But ultimately, that arc saves a lot of money for taxpayers in the long run. And I think that's been the mayor's objective.
What I am hearing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that we could make this kind of a payment without going back into negotiations.
We could put, without blinking, $100 million of necessary, neglected public works construction stuff that has to happen right now. We do it in pieces. We do not have a credit rating. We have no access to the markets whatsoever to issue another bond. So unlike every other municipality in Pennsylvania, and there's 2,200 of them, we cannot go to market still after receivership. And we have to address this in a way that has a cash reserve. We have a debt fund policy, which I think is 25% of the budget, has to be at least there in the debt service policy, which was recommended to us by the Commonwealth. So to me, there's lots of moving parts to it. And those are just, I think, governance decisions. That's what people have been, the council and the mayor elected to do, is to make those. And they're cautious because the future before COVID, it was hard to see where we would be in the long term. If we can't get back to the market, which is really the normal thing for a local government to do, or even a state government, is to have, you borrow for things, and I agree with Charlie, they should be long-term projects, and you pay for them over time. That's how you do infrastructure. But our obligations haven't changed for infrastructure. They're all still here. We still have to pave the streets. We still have to put the light poles up that get knocked down. We have to deal with CRW on lots of the pieces to these compliance with stormwater coming forward. So there are a lot of a lot of things that we have obligations to pay for and never enough revenue to pay for them. And so we pace them out over time. The mayor has a long lens on things like that. He's very aware of the long-term obligations that we have. And he's careful because of that, because it would be very easy to put us back into a box where there is no money and no access to funds, and the city could not fulfill its obligations for health, safety, and welfare. That would be a place they're worried about getting.
And I'm not a fiscal guru and do not play one on TV, but I'm curious if we are able to pay down the debt quicker, doesn't that assist us with getting a credit rating back?
I am not a fiscal guru either. My understanding is it's an entire expensive campaign. CRW went through it, had to hire a whole team of people to do it, and it was a lot of money to do it. They did that partly under the consent decree with EPA and DEP because they had to borrow to put in sewer improvements. So those are all just, they're steps that have to happen. But you know, a new obligation rolls through the door of City Hall every day. I mean, that's just the reality.
It is clear, though, that we've got to figure out a way to get back in the market.
Yes, and that's a
I
discussion.
mean, we're sitting here paying 6.75% interest on this. It's an interest rate that is almost unfathomable in the world that we're living in. If we could pay this down and go refinance the thing, if they have back debt, it would make sense.
But there are other realities, and you know this. I mean, there's no parking revenue right now, but for the parking tax. There's no parking revenue next year, but for the parking tax. There's no. What's going to happen next year is the business privilege tax is going to dry up dramatically. Their stadium, they're probably, if they don't open, and it may not open for the spring, is going to invoke force majeure again, and then we have to pay the stadium debt. I mean, there are balances that have to be made. You know, and that is what the mayor balances.
And I think I prefaced my remarks by saying that we're only looking at this. We have a myopic view that doesn't have the panorama of potential problems, expenses, and other things that you need.
Right.
I'm just trying to point out, if you could get to this place, it would make a lot of sense financially.
Yeah, I guess the question is
we are not making a recommendation here about what to do. I want to make sure everybody's clear of that. We are not, not trying to run the city from the controller's office, and I haven't done that since I got here, and I'm not going to. I'm just trying to show with an illustration, more or less, of what's possible.
So, and I think what this board exists related to, Act 124, and the mayor is very painfully aware, there's a $12 million cliff that comes, you know, after the end of Act 124 status. You know, that's a reality. Nothing that we get for neighborhood services fund, not a penny of it, goes into for general. That's not the general fund money. So it is this type of taxation that goes in to pay for police and fire, parks and rec, and those type of things that we have for computer systems. And, you know, and the only place $12 million comes from is literally cutting personnel in public safety. That's where the money is. And, you know, that is a problem that is enormous.
There is no scenario we've been able to run up here that lets the city make it on that without some part of that tax, at least some part of that tax. I mean, it's just not doable. If we cut our debt down to zero, we would save $8 million a year. That's 4 short. And that would be if we are going to live hand to mouth. It doesn't give us any ability to invest or anything like that. So, I mean, I'm not recommending that either. I mean, it's not livable. It is not. We can't make it without that tax or some portion of that tax, even if we pay the debt down. But all I was saying is it would give us some more options.
But I do think it's a healthy discussion to have with everybody here. You know, both you're in that world where we are, and where we're looking at that it gets factored in. I mean, that's how the mayor's making his decisions based on those balances. He would love to pay debt down. I think you know that. I mean, he feels obligated, I think rightfully so, to maximize it for the taxpayers. And that's why it was a 3-year negotiation to get where we got. And
And they did a good job with that, I'd like to say. You know, we were really pleased with what he was able to get out of them.
right, so and you know, that part would be done, but for the fact that we are in a pandemic, and the uncertainty with that does mess with us. I will say that. I mean, I think it messes with all of us. So
Kathy, you're on mute. She's working on it. I do think, and I appreciate Charlie, because you shared this with me early on, the whole idea that there's this $9 million that ends. And while it doesn't cover all of it, it would allow some disciplined projections of lessening the reliance on the entirety of the extraordinary taxing. Kathy.
And I think we're going the same place, Audrey. I mean, if this were a personal situation, I can understand if you had some savings and you had the ability to pay it on some debt, but we're still expecting extraordinary expenses, that you might kind of middle it and put some on the debt and keep some in reserve just in case. But I think this is the kind of discussion that we should be having more of with the appropriate people within the city, because I mean, this just looks like it would be a good thing for the city to get rid of that huge debt that fast. And I hear Charlie saying, and I suspect Neil would probably agree, that we can't make it without part of the tax money from the Commonwealth. But I mean, the reality of the situation may or may not be that we just don't get additional tax money from the Commonwealth because of all the Commonwealth will be going through as the result of COVID as well. So, I mean, I think we've just got to be prepared for that, whether we want to be prepared for it or not. So it's scary.
I would really like to hear, you know, we were able to get, for example, we were able to borrow money for the streetlights, because we were able to show that it was a actual self-liquidating bond. And I think we have been a real good, that should be really helping our credit rating with anybody who's looking at us. I mean, I don't know how the bond market works. I'm not really into that kind of thing, but I know that you can still sell, people will still buy Greek bonds and they're not worse off than we are. And it seems to me that the level of interest that we're paying here at 6.75%, at the way people are chasing yield right now, we could probably get, if we could do 4, you know, we'd be okay. I just don't understand exactly why we keep saying we can't get in the market. Maybe Jeffrey, you know.
Yeah, so if I could just jump in, I don't have the answers, and I've spent a lot of my career in the bond market, but I don't know the exact answers for Harrisburg's situation. But I'd like to tell just a very quick anecdote for what it's worth. When the city of New York in the 1970s ran into serious fiscal distress, we all know that story, and the federal government decided that they were not going to help the city, bail the city out. And their bonds, too, were reduced to junk bond status during that event. The state of New York created an entity which really isn't that unusual, and you would probably be familiar with it from water and sewer departments across the Commonwealth. What they created was, in essence, a financing authority just for the city of New York. And what the state did in that story was they gave an extraordinary taxing authority, not to the city of New York, but they took a levy. In that case, it was an additional sales tax levy, and they gave it directly to the financing authority. And so that the financing authority of the city of New York had its own dedicated revenue source separate from the city. And in exchange for doing that, the financing authority bought the bonds off the back of the city of New York. And they guaranteed it by the revenue from the sales tax that they were granted. I am not suggesting in any way that that scenario would definitely work here. It certainly is a very complicated scenario, but it's an interesting and illustrative story of how another city in another place in another time in another state was able to work itself out of a very similar jam. And it took state legislation, it took extraordinary taxing authority, which are things that we've already talked about with the city of Harrisburg. But what it did is create this separate entity, as we understand financing authorities often are. And that financing authority was able to take some of the pressure of the debt off the city that it was trying to help. And in doing so, that helped improve over time the city's credit rating. Once again, not suggesting that that scenario could be imposed in.
Well, actually, Jeffrey, I think that's the situation we're in now.
Yeah.
And that we went through that with the, I would suggest that's the situation we're in now. We're at the end of that. We went through that with the restructuring that was imposed on us by the state. And we are almost debt free, almost. And we have this one last chunk that we owe AMPEC. It just seems so close. So, and if we could get some combination of the city itself getting into the bond market and being able to borrow some money for actual expenses, the ones Neil delineated, like real capital expense, and get rid of this 6.75% nothing debt, which we actually have the cash to do if we felt confident. And I think Neil was kind of alluding to this. We have some kind of confidence if we need money, we can go borrow some. But if we can't get that kind of confidence that we're going to be able to access capital when we need it, then you want to start hoarding stuff. And so to me, that's a critical question of, are we going to ever be able to borrow money again? It seems to me that we have every year since I've been here, every year since the mayor's been here, we have had a positive cash budget. We've closed the books with positive cash flow every year. That ought to impress somebody. In the environment we're in right now, particularly, that we're creditworthy. So that's another discussion, not mine. I don't know if you guys could talk to somebody who can understand how the investor mind in municipal bonds work. That'd be the right guy to talk to. But anyway, I think that was what I was asked to do, and there it is.
And Charlie, I appreciate your report. I'm also, I had one technical question for you. The $5 million payment that's on your projection sheet, is that roughly the equivalent of the AMPEC payment we're talking about right now? In other words, your calculation was not done presuming the AMPEC payment was also made?
No,
Okay.
This would be without that.
Right, and so yours wasn't discounted by the mayor's negotiations either, but that's kind of a marginal thing anyhow.
Yeah, well, it's not really marginal, 1.38. I mean, it's a lot of money. You did a really good job on that. And it would be a lot rosier if we put that together, but the complexity of trying to put that, it's not just putting it together we could do, but then explaining it to you, I feel like I'm selling life insurance.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't mean to say marginal in the sense of meaningless. I meant marginal in terms of, relative numbers. But I think this is a really good discussion that we probably ought to have separately in context of the 5-year plan and related materials, because obviously, we could use a little bit more expertise on what it takes what it will take for the city to restore or to obtain and restore a credit rating. I'm also just curious whether any of it is affected, or how it's affected, because it has to be, by the receivership and then by the remaining recovery plan. And then also how that's affected by things like fiscal practices, accounting practices, compliance with GASB, and all the rest of it, which I know are also elements of what investors are going to be looking at when they make a determination whether we are a good risk for investment purposes. But so
I do
great
think we're
discussion, but something to carry for a later time.
I do think Harrisburg's a challenge to underwrite because the receivership was such a unique
Right.
thing, and people don't know what to make of it. And we
Right.
have these 40-year deals with court orders on them, which also I think makes people nervous about putting their money somewhere.
Right.
They don't
You
seem
know,
to be going with, they don't seem to be willing to accept the full faith and credit of the city anymore.
I don't know
It
what
used to
that's
be
about.
so easy. It used to be
Yeah.
so easy.
So,
Well, full faith and credit also hinges on available tax capacity. So,
They never
even,
looked at
even
that.
though the Debt Act allows us to, levy whatever tax we need in order to pay the debt off, there is ultimately a practical limit to that as well. And to Jeffrey's comment earlier, I don't anticipate the Pennsylvania legislature allowing an extraordinary taxing authority or a different tax base, more specifically, for retirement of debt. So, Charlie, to your earlier point, where we can find self-liquidating debt, that's great. But for capital projects and some of the things like that, that we're going to need to be looking at, unfortunately, GO is going to be the only really available route.
I agree with you. I'd like it to be the available route, though. Right now, they keep saying we can't get on that path, and I just want to know, when are we ever going to be able to? Because we can't, and I think Neil would agree with this. I think sometimes Neil and I agree with things with each other.
you shouldn't say that, Charlie.
What's that?
You shouldn't say that.
Oh, I'm sorry. We can't live without being able to access the capital market eventually, and we got to figure out how to do that. And it's a good time to figure it out, I think.
Well, I think there have been a lot of good suggestions, and I think most importantly, it is that this is an important part of this 5-year plan that we're looking at, because all of this falls within that horizon, certainly the end of the GO debt. Neil, any way you can help us remain in that conversation and help explore a lot of these issues that we've talked about, that would be great. And Charlie and Bill will continue to rely on you to raise these issues as you see them and explain them, because I think that's even more important. As you said, you're not advocating a point of view, you're just trying to inform. Are there...
Question for Charlie.
Sorry.
Sorry?
I have a question for Charlie.
Okay.
I'm comparing the report you just sent us with the city's mid-year report. Did you take note on the projected ending fund balance for the general fund, and the fact that they're significantly different in your report versus the city's?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could help draw a line to connect those differences, please, if you're able to do that.
Thank you, Bill.
I'm not really sure.
What's that?
I have no comment about the mid-year report.
Okay. Well, we are, we started at a different place and we ended at a different place than the mid-year report. Did they ever get to start at the same time, at the same place we did with the fund balance?
I believe the revised mid-year report, we both start with the same beginning fund balance number for 2020.
And the divergence, we have been pretty clear about how we did the projections, which is more of a pretty rudimentary straight line projection. And whatever we took whatever we spent actual, and we took prior year and plugged it into the second, whatever we had left. I mean, it wasn't really rocket science what we did. And but it's always worked for the past 6 or 7 years I've been here. We've always been within a couple of million, not even, we've been closer now. We've been with the thousands of dollars of where actuals were. So we didn't agree with the number when it came out, and we still don't agree with it. But it's a projection, and I don't get involved in disagreeing with projections. What's the point? You know, it could be any way. We did it the way we did it, and we're comfortable with our number.
I think both their mid-year report and our projection for revenue are probably much closer than the expenditure side, which I think is where the differences lie. I believe they're probably projecting something closer to budget, where we are far short of that.
We can't see how they can get the budget in the amount of time we have left, how they would do it. They'd have to work really hard at it. I mean, part of this is the personnel side. We're way down in healthcare costs, which is driving a lot of this projection. And I still don't, it's very difficult to know why that's happened, and it's very difficult to know. The tide will come in one day, I'm quite sure, but how long it's going to stay out there, I don't know. But we got a lot, there's a lot of money that would have to be spent between now and the end of the year to hit that budget number. Well, I don't think we were projecting they were going to hit that budget number before the COVID hit. We didn't think they could spend it. I mean, they could if they tried, but we didn't see how they were going to do it.
Thanks for the additional comments. And just so you see what I'm seeing, the report, Charlie, that you have for us is projecting $32.5 million general fund balance.
Correct.
And that's including a $5 million payment to AMBAC, an early prepayment. It's not including any bonus on that prepayment because that amount was budgeted already.
Yeah, it's not in there.
Yeah,
because it's entirely optional. So we're just looking at this is what it would be without making that payment.
Sorry, without the payment, because your notes say the projections based on the budget includes $5 million to AMBAC.
We didn't include that projection.
Yes,
Okay, yeah,
that is budgeted.
I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I
So
should
that's
talk about
including,
good projection.
yeah, it's including $5 million to AMBAC.
Right, 39%, 38%.
Right. Doesn't include the bonus, right? And the city's mid-year report projects 17.5 million, it's a $15 million difference. And the city's projection does include that AMBAC $5 million repayment as well.
Yes, the debt service that we have in our projection is right off the budget. So it is the full amount of the budgeted debt service for 2020. The rest of them are straight line projections.
Well, I would also throw in my hat in the ring on Doug's comments regarding the update to the 5-year financial plan. I think, Charlie, I really admired the point you made about having options. And I think that's not only sensible, but I think it's prudent. And I can see how a planning process would be much more robust with a series of options to consider. And I think, Neil, to your point about the interconnectedness and the number of considerations that have to be made by the folks in the city to balance different priorities. And I understand the importance of that. And that's the point of the 5-year plan, right? To weigh the various options.
Exactly.
So the point is to weigh them and then settle upon a plan, understanding that there are options, but settling upon a plan that describes the way forward. And the 5-year plan that we started with certainly doesn't get us all the way where we need to get to the future. It was a start.
Respectfully suggest there's nothing that gets us all the way we need to go to the future. There is nothing. And if people think otherwise, it's just silly. It is nothing there. A change in the law has to happen. It's what happened in Pittsburgh, what's happened in Scranton, and what happened in Philadelphia. They have to change there has to be a modification. It's not going to be the same thing. We don't know what it's going to be. We just know it's not going to be the same thing. Pittsburgh got an extra 1% sales tax attributed to Pittsburgh plus a drink tax. Philly had a second entity just like New York to issue bonds and sweep tax revenues over there to pay them. And then they got an additional sales tax that they were allowed to collect instead of just the Commonwealth. I'm saying, so there are solutions. It's just they're large. Harrisburg's Hill's a tough place. They got to feel the need to do a solution. Unlike those 3 cities, which are each the only ones in their classification, Harrisburg is one of 53 cities that are third-class cities. And it makes a solution much harder under the state constitution for one place versus every place. And the Hill knows that. That's the struggle. I mean, it is a struggle. I've been at this 10 years. It is a struggle to try and come up with a solution that solves the problem.
Well, we've been given an opportunity, and so we need to move forward on this path as best we can to at least show, in my opinion, best faith effort. And the end will be become evident, and at that point, we will have been able to prove what we have done to make inroads. I agree with everything that's said. I do think let's keep these conversations going. I'd like to move forward. We have one more agenda item. I think that Charlie and Bill are always willing to take questions. So let's keep questions coming. And as we see different subjects, I know they're willing to come back and we can continue to address different slivers of the pie and become even more informed and perhaps find another one of those options. So thank you guys. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
And for the next agenda item, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is great fun for me because I had the pleasure to introduce a fairly recent graduate of Gettysburg College, a gentleman by the name of Ben Potts. Ben Potts has already impressed me in that he is about to start his Fulbright scholarship in England, I believe Manchester, and he has already been accepted at a major Ivy League law school for next fall. One of the things that Ben did while at Gettysburg was a comparison of the city of Harrisburg and the city of Lancaster with regard to some of its social interactions, and I'll let him define that better than I possibly could. But often we hear comparisons of Harrisburg to Lancaster, and we're all aware of the differences, but I thought this was something that would be useful for the board of the ICA to hear about. It is such a great pleasure for me because back in 1959, and the history lesson will be brief, a woman by the name of Genevieve Blatt started talking about setting up an internship, which happened in the 1960s, for the former Secretary of the Commonwealth, a gentleman by the name of James Finnegan. If you wish to Google it, the gentleman's background is very, very impressive. As a result of that internship, I wound up in Harrisburg a number of years later, still in the age of the dinosaurs. But more recently, Ben was among our Finnegan intern winners. And I think this is just an excellent opportunity for us to hear from him and in terms of his detailed research on a topic that is of interest to us. So without more, I will introduce Ben and ask you all to make him feel welcome at our meeting this afternoon. Ben?
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here and enjoyed listening to that conversation just now. Even as it got into the weeds a little bit, but in any case, it's nice to see some familiar faces and nice to meet virtually those of you who I haven't. This may be a shot in the dark, but I seem to think, and I in circa 2013, I believe I may have run in with Mr. Doug Hill. Is it possible that you would have moderated a mock legislative session with the Hugh O'Brien Foundation? If so, you look familiar to me from
Yes,
that.
I was Speaker of the House. Yep.
Well, I was, I guess, a member of the mock house. So in any case, with that, hello. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, hopefully you can now see my screen. So in any case, I know that we're a little maybe behind schedule, so I'll try and keep this as brief as I can. But I spent my senior year at Gettysburg looking at kind of these two big questions as part of a senior thesis project. And I'm originally from Lancaster and I'm currently in Lancaster, and had spent some time interning in a nonprofit organization, the Lancaster Housing Opportunity Partnership, and spent really kind of the summer in meetings with civic leaders, and followed the CEO of this organization around 2 meetings, and was struck by just how interconnected nonprofit organizations and local governments in the city and the county and municipalities were in tackling some of these public policy problems. And so kind of built a project around looking into kind of what factors breed those conditions and how they might be replicated elsewhere to the extent that that's a desirable thing to do. So in any case, here's essentially what I did. I spent much of last summer reading existing literature kind of in this area, and ended up over the course of the last academic year interviewing about 20 civic leaders, both in Lancaster and in Harrisburg, to try and glean some themes about where each of the communities are. And I did a little bit of statistical work that I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on today. And then I wrote a thesis about it. So the basic kind of theory seems to be that when social capital and civic virtue and financial resources come together, that is when you can have successful civic capacity to solve public policy problems. And the particular initiative that I'm going to discuss in a little bit more detail is a neighborhood revitalization project in the southwest part of Lancaster, which is historically one of the, in fact, is probably the poorest quadrant of the city, but that has recently had a remarkable degree of success through some public-private partnerships and through kind of the levers of local government and the nonprofit sector working together, has had some remarkable success in kind of rebuilding, reshaping that community. And so just in terms of some working definitions, those are kind of how I defined the terms, but I want to move ahead and just mention briefly that there's this idea that it's all a money problem, and there's some research out there to suggest that, you know, poor communities do tend to struggle to build a sense of collective efficacy, is the term that the academics use. This idea that working together with our neighbors, we can solve problems in our neighborhood, whether they're crime, economic opportunity, educational opportunities. But that the strongest research suggests that the strength of local nonprofit organizations and the sense of the citizens living in those neighborhoods being invested in them is the best predictor of this idea of collective efficacy. And that certainly is what seems to be going on in Lancaster, and in particular with this Southwest Lancaster neighborhood revitalization project. And so just some themes from the interviews. There is a sense in Lancaster of shared vision among community leaders, and it was certainly built over time. It didn't, you know, arise from nowhere. And there's a sense that once everyone kind of agreed on what the playbook was, everyone could kind of hold hands and jump together. And that was a direct quote from a leader of kind of the Economic Development Corporation of Lancaster. And she had mentioned that once everyone got on the same page and was singing from the same hymnal, so to say, to mix those metaphors, that you know, the community was able to center around this vision and attract the outside financial investment, both from private foundations, from some state grants from DCED, and then perhaps most importantly in the case of the Southwest, or So We, that's the logo on the bottom left initiative, is how they've branded that. But the Wells Fargo Regional Foundation invested about $2 million, a little more than $2 million over the course of 5 years in this grassroots neighborhood building project that has really reshaped that neighborhood. And I interviewed several leaders from that neighborhood. And perhaps the thing to note about what I learned in Harrisburg, and certainly I doubt much of this will be news to all of you, but that I perhaps expected to find a little bit more of a clean juxtaposition between Lancaster and Harrisburg, where, you know, these 5 things are going right in Lancaster and those same 5 things are not going right in Harrisburg. But perhaps not surprisingly, it's a little bit more of a nuanced picture. One thing that does seem to be the case is that Harrisburg obviously has had more acute recent fiscal distress, as the conversation we just had alluded to. And so that has created some perhaps more acute challenges than Lancaster has had to deal with, but Lancaster as a third-class city is confronting many of the same fiscal challenges. Lancaster is well endowed with private family foundations to a degree that is not matched really in a lot of other places. It's been referred to by leaders in Lancaster as something of a sleeping giant, but between there's the High Family Foundation, the Steinmans, the Barshingers, there are just there's a lot of old money, to be quite candid, that has been able to underwrite some significant projects. But what is the case in Harrisburg, as it is in Lancaster, is a sense of civic pride, and there does seem to be, as perhaps evidenced by this organization, a growing willingness among institutions both within and independent of government to work together to kind of realize that no one entity is going to solve a city's problems. And then the third places note there is there's this idea that outside of home and work, the third places where people spend their time, the more vibrant those are, the stronger a community will be. And Lancaster in particular has had some success building some third places. And I think that, Harrisburg, in the Midtown region in particular, the Midtown Scholar Bookstore would be an example of a third place where, when there isn't a pandemic, people are gathering. I did just want to pull out a couple of quotes from people I interviewed in Lancaster. And then on the next slide, there's one from the mayor of Harrisburg. But Mayor Deneen Sirachi mentioned that kind of one thing that she confronts, or I guess kind of twin realities, are that as the mayor of a third-class city, as you alluded to earlier, there are limited revenue-raising options, but that at the same time, citizens expect things to get done, and that's kind of where Jim Schultz, who led the Southwest Neighborhood Revitalization Project from his perch, working with the Lancaster Housing Opportunity Partnership, and he's actually the former executive deputy secretary of DCED back when I guess it was the Department of Community Affairs. But in any case, it's kind of this twin reality of needing to attract financial support, but simultaneously you can't build up people's hopes only to dash them by not getting the support. So what was key for Jim, as I interviewed him, is that the Wells Fargo Regional Foundation put up money on the front end to do a community-led planning process for this neighborhood. But there was the commitment that if a plan was viable and had sufficient community input for the foundation, there would also be money on the back end to implement it. And so this plan that has been, implemented and is now in, I believe, year 3 of 5 in the Southwest neighborhood, has been built around resident priorities such as rebuilding housing facade improvements, particularly to owner-occupied housing of low and moderate income residents. It has helped rebuild the Culleton Park, which is a central park, as kind of a gathering place for the community. It was a place where at one point was kind of a hub of a lot of drug activity, and the neighbors have kind of reclaimed that park through some money to both put better facilities in it, but also things like lighting. And so when these priorities came from the residents themselves, this project was much more successful than 10 years prior, when City Hall kind of tried to take a swing at revitalizing this neighborhood without a lot of resident input. It led to one of these plans that Jim's referring to, where you get people kind of around the table, you build up their hopes, and then nothing ever happens. And that has a downward spiraling effect in terms of this notion of social capital in a community. And then related to this money situation, when I interviewed Mayor Poppenfuss, he talked about this fiscal reality that you can, that you're all acutely aware of, but that institutional constraints matter, and that Lancaster's ability to raise money privately and not rely on its tax revenue to do a lot of the work that has recently led to this kind of downtown renaissance that has been taken note of, that people have taken note of throughout the state and indeed kind of around the Mid-Atlantic region. It wouldn't have happened in the absence of private philanthropy. And so you can't just look at it as a situation where Lancaster city government got things done and Harrisburg's didn't. And so those institutional constraints certainly have mattered. And so, I think that it's the case that, like many third-class cities, Lancaster and Harrisburg both have structural challenges, but that Lancaster was the exception in finding a lot of outside support, both outside support within its community through some of these private foundations, but also in the case of the one discrete neighborhood revitalization project that there was money from a regional foundation, that the institutional environment matters. There's a real sense in Lancaster that no one organization does anything without the other ones knowing about it. And in fact, that can almost, go too far at times. One nonprofit leader told me that, organizations that try and do things on their own end up kind of getting shunned, that no one wants to work with them because there's this kind of real sense of co-branding initiatives, and that, the city's going to rise or fall together. And that's can be healthy. But of course, that can also, lead to exclusion and fiefdoms and whatnot that, can be a double-edged sword. So I think maybe one lesson or one thought would be how to kind of temper that. But the other thing that is true, and that Jim Schultz is kind of a classic example of a policy entrepreneur in the Lancaster case, is that, there's no way around the fact that in the Southwest Neighborhood Project, it was built from the bottom up, and that there is currently a 25-member neighborhood board consisting of more than half of which are members of the neighborhood. And that's by a charter that, you often get a sense in neighborhood revitalization projects that people outside the neighborhood want it more than people inside the neighborhood, or at least want something different. And so there is an intentional institutional design where the people who are driving how this outside money gets spent have to live in the neighborhood, or have to be a business owner in the neighborhood, or another nonprofit stakeholder of the neighborhood. So there's not a lot of credit claiming off the top from particular political interests or otherwise. And so I think those are maybe some quick takeaways. And I think that's kind of the end of where I'll pause here. I'd be happy to chat about this, or I'm also happy to let you move on since I think we're over time. But let me stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to all of you. Thank you again for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Ben. I'm pretty sure you quoted Lisa Riggs, and I'd jump anywhere with her. She is a dynamo that if one could replicate, every city would have a true winner. She makes it happen. I spend a lot of time in Lancaster, and noting what they did in this COVID response. And again, I think it's been what you said. They got together and they said, we're all going to sink unless we all get together and we make sure that we dissect these issues and figure out how to address each of those.
I think the COVID response is a good example too, and just to elaborate on that really briefly, one tenet of Lancaster as one of the 7 largest counties in the state got a direct allocation from the federal government early, which put it at an advantage relative to some other counties, but immediately formed a group with the Economic Development Corporation and the Chamber of Commerce to pump a lot of money out to small businesses, and I think they've weathered some of this probably better. And again, we're set up by the institutional environment to weather some of this better than cities that were waiting until June, July, cities and counties, I guess, till June or July to get federal support.
Any other questions or observations? One quick question, would you mind if we put your thesis on the website, or at least released it if people requested it?
Sure. No, I would not mind. Sure. Happy to.
All right. Thanks. Jeffrey will take care of that. Well, Ben, thank you. Sorry, Doug.
I had one quick question. So I know you part of your work was doing some projections. And at least until COVID hit, we had been seeing, I know Lancaster in particular, but Harrisburg to a little bit lesser degree, seeing some increase in residential population. Is that something that you found, and how does that contribute toward the conclusion of whether there's potential for growth in the tax base?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lancaster's population has grown in the last 10 years, and I think the planning office projects that it will continue to grow. You know, it's interesting because that actually kind of relates to one of the challenges that Lancaster is going to face, which is that the population growth is tied to a lot of economic development, wherein the jobs are at an income level that is not consistent with where the housing stock is growing. And so one of the challenges, I guess you could say, of having this social capital built up from people in a different income group is that they're not always apt to want to have affordable housing developments built. And there was a recent example in which a municipal zoning board shot down what would have been a large housing development that would have housed a lot of workers at a urban outfitters plant in kind of the southeastern part of Lancaster County. And so in that context, having a well-organized community that knows how to exercise the levers of its power could actually somewhat paradoxically cut against the kind of big picture growth of the county. And that's a challenge that I think local government leaders are taking notice of. Affordable housing is, you know, a kind of one of the tenets that I think the community is going to have to address next. And it remains to be seen whether being well organized in a sort of civic way with public and private partnerships already built will help or hurt in that endeavor. I think that's an open question.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Again, Ben, thank you very much, and enjoy your Fulbright, then come back and stay in touch and keep observing. We're now at the point in the agenda for other business. No one has notified me, but I open it up to you all for anything else that's on your minds. And if we're all minded out, I'll ask Jeffrey if he's gotten any public comment, and he's shaking his head no. So in that case,
Madam Chair, there are 2 points I would like to raise.
okay.
One, I will reiterate.
I'm sorry, and if we in the future can keep that under other business before we open it up for public comment, because you're one of us, Neil.
Yes, I realize that. I just don't have an agenda in front of me. I don't know exactly
Okay.
where you are in the agenda. I just have screens that are very small. I will reiterate that, again, that I am fully authorized to negotiate an agreement with the ICA. Under the third-class city code, the city solicitor drafts the contracts. Under the city code, this office drafts all legislation, pre-approves it to go to city council. Those are the 2 pieces that are needed for an agreement to be approved by the city of Harrisburg. And that is there. I had not had an opportunity to respond to your letter. I appreciate your letter from the other day, but I will reiterate that. I have done this for a long time. I have never seen an agreement successfully negotiated with clients at the table, ever, because they feel they need to talk to their lawyer, or their lawyer feels they need to talk to them, and commitments get made or unmade, and it sometimes muddies the water. And if you talk to others who have done this, that is one of the realities. I don't know if you remember when Ed Rendell was governor, they did negotiations in public for the budget, and nothing ever happened at the open negotiation. It always was what happened otherwise. That's just a human nature reality from my experience. 2, I received a memorandum this morning from the Hill, which maybe you folks have received or not. I know this body has not hired a lobbyist and publicly voted for a lobbying position, but the memorandum is to alter Act 124 to remove giving it a firm sunset date of January 1, 2023, and removing all of the extraordinary taxing authority from the city of Harrisburg at that moment on January 1, 2023. You might not be surprised that that particular detail was not well received and won't be well received because it goes back to what does that taxing authority pay for? And that taxing authority pays for public safety. That's what it pays for. If that's what the board's view should happen, I would suggest in reality, things will go nowhere. If that is the board and its members are lobbying to do that, that is going to be a problem. And my job is I represent the municipality. That is the client of the Law Bureau in Harrisburg, the city of Harrisburg and its taxpayers. We also speak with and for the public officials, and we usually are the liaisons between the public officials. But there's not going to be a public official who is happy with the idea that a board has gone up and said, take away the city's money flat out as legislation. Frankly, it feels irresponsible from where I sit, having lived in this city for 30 years. We will look further at it, but it wasn't a local official who made the request. It was an official out of York or Gettysburg, I forget which of the two. But if that's what's going to move forward, I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of difficulty going forward on anything at that point. And my job is to be frank, so that's my frank.
And I will respond based on one of the things you said. No, we have never hired a lobbyist, nor would we. We are merely here to implement Act 124. We did write an assessment of our Act 203 report that did go to the General Assembly. I'm sure they took it to heart. We have been trying to proceed with the agreement. We have been trying to keep communications open with the city. And so I guess I am not surprised. It is certainly, we do not want the city to lose its taxing authority, and we'll have to respond to whatever comes from the legislature, and I don't know what form that takes. No one has sent me anything, so I will research. I don't know if others have comments.
My mute button's not working great. Audrey, Madam Chair, I do think it plays to the sense of urgency around Neil's point about the finalizing an intergovernmental cooperation agreement. I think, hopefully I speak for everybody on the board, that we all share that sense of urgency. I think that there's also a sense of urgency from the members of the board, and I'll venture to speak on behalf of the members of the board for there to be a good planning process as envisioned by the Act. And I think that planning process, without preconceptions as to what the result has to be, I think an open, honest, robust planning process is the path forward. We can talk about the restrictions, we can talk about the difficulties and the challenges that have plagued the city, and people have talked about them before, and I think all of us here have a good sense of what a lot of the hindrances are and what a lot of the obstacles are. I think what we don't have a good sense of is what is the shared vision to move forward to begin to achieve the objectives of Act 124, which is the restoration of the city's credit rating and the restoration of financial stability for Harrisburg. I think that's our purpose. And I think the first big milestone, again, to Neil's point, I think it really is the finalization of that agreement. And I think given the season where we are in September, I think right on its heels is the planning process surrounding the city's 5-year financial plan. I think those are important. And I know hopefully I speak for all of us, but I know I, for one, am here and excited and fully committed to to being a constructive part of that process.
Definitely agree with you, Ralph. Thank you for stating it so eloquently. So, Neil, I think you have heard, we have been, there has never been a time where we have not been supportive of the city and have offered to meet, to help, to assist, and we continue to do that. So let's get a meeting on the calendar and let's address, obviously, the agreement, but I would also like to make sure we're addressing the cooperative working relationship and moving toward the revised 5-year financial plan, because we want it to come out such that it's acceptable and representative of what the city needs and what we need to keep moving forward, because that is a roadmap as well. So Jeffrey, I'll ask you if you can work with Neil to let's get a meeting on to talk about the general topics. And then we can also work to establish something for the agreement itself.
So Audrey, I would respectfully suggest that you have who you're going to have for a while. You have me. That's who you have from the city right now. The one you're going to be sitting down with, or there's people aren't going to be sitting down. That's where we're at.
I appreciate that, and we will work with you. I would also encourage you to see if we can also find more efficient ways, for example, to have Jeffrey working with someone in the budget office. I think I appreciate that you're it, that you've been deputized it, but I also think there's always room for other conversations. So in the meantime, yes, Neil, you're it. I appreciate that. So thank you. That was not the ending I had planned, but again, a robust meeting with information and lots going on. So if I could, would someone make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Can I have a second?
Second.
We all in favor, we'll just go ahead and do the vote.
Aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you very much. I think it's the last Wednesday in October that is our next meeting. And please tune in. I am going to guarantee we've moved mountains between now and then. Goodbye, everyone.
Stay safe.